The laughter started before Frank Dawson even reached the front of the conference room. 40 years behind the wheel. 3 million accident-free miles. And somehow, none of that mattered anymore. The giant screen behind the executives displayed colorful charts and profit projections while dozens of managers filled the room. Frank stood quietly near the door. His faded work jacket looked completely out of place among expensive suits and polished shoes. The young executives barely looked at him. To them, he was just another aging truck driver. A relic. A man whose time had passed. Then the company's new chief operations officer smiled and pointed toward Frank. Perfect timing. The room grew quiet. We were actually discussing modernization. A few managers chuckled. The executive continued. This company doesn't run on old instincts anymore. It runs on data, algorithms, and automation. Several heads nodded. Then he looked directly at Frank. Not notebooks and truck stop maps. The room erupted with laughter. Frank said nothing. His weathered face revealed almost no emotion. But deep down, the words hit harder than anyone realized. Because for 23 years, Frank had devoted his life to keeping the company alive. He missed birthdays, anniversaries, family holidays, storms, blizzards. He drove through conditions that shut entire states down. And now, he was being mocked by people who had never spent a single night on the road. The executive folded his arms. Frank, we're replacing outdated routing systems next month. Another manager grinned. You can finally retire and enjoy fishing. More laughter. Frank looked around the room. Not one person defended him. Not one. That was the moment everything changed. Because what nobody realized was that Frank wasn't simply a truck driver. He was the architect. The invisible architect behind the entire logistics network that made the company successful. And the people laughing at him had absolutely no idea. 3 days later, Frank quietly submitted his resignation. No speech. No argument. No complaints. Just a single sheet of paper. The Human Resources Department processed it within minutes. The executives barely noticed. In fact, they celebrated. One manager joked that removing old employees would improve efficiency. Another claimed artificial intelligence would replace drivers within a few years. Nobody called Frank. Nobody thanked him. Nobody asked why he was leaving. And that would become the most expensive mistake in company history. The company operated across 3 states. Hundreds of trucks. Thousands of daily deliveries. Millions of dollars in freight. Everything appeared normal. At first, Monday morning arrived. Dispatch screens lit up. Drivers started their routes. Warehouses loaded trailers. Executives reviewed performance reports. Business as usual. Then a shipment disappeared. A high-priority medical delivery failed to arrive. Managers blamed a driver. An hour later, another shipment vanished from tracking. Then another. And another. Suddenly, dispatchers noticed something strange. Routes that should take 6 hours were taking 10. Drivers became trapped in unexpected traffic patterns. Warehouses started receiving conflicting delivery schedules. Fuel expenses surged. Customers began calling. Angry. Confused. Demanding answers. The company reassured everyone that the issue was temporary. But then things got worse. Much worse. By Tuesday afternoon, dozens of deliveries had failed. By Wednesday, hundreds were delayed. Major clients threatened penalties. Warehouses overflowed. Drivers sat idle. Retail stores ran out of inventory. Entire supply chains started breaking apart. Executives rushed into emergency meetings. Nobody understood what was happening. The software looked fine. The servers were working. The GPS systems were active. Everything appeared normal. Except nothing worked. Because hidden beneath the polished software was a secret layer nobody knew existed. A layer Frank had built over 2 decades. Years earlier, the company had nearly collapsed during a nationwide transportation crisis. Back then, expensive routing software repeatedly failed. Executives panicked. Consultants charged millions. Experts offered theories. Nothing solved the problem. Until Frank stepped in. During nights and weekends, he studied traffic data, weather patterns, fuel consumption, driver habits, construction schedules, seasonal bottlenecks. He built a routing framework from scratch. At first, it was nothing more than handwritten notes. Then spreadsheets. Then custom databases. Over time, it evolved into the foundation of the entire operation. The software executives loved wasn't actually doing most of the work. Frank's hidden framework was every route, every optimization, every backup system, every emergency adjustment. Everything flowed through processes only Frank fully understood. And when he left, those systems slowly stopped adapting. The company had unknowingly removed its own brain. Thursday morning brought disaster. A regional distribution center shut down. Over 100 trucks sat waiting for instructions. Drivers grew frustrated. Customers grew furious. News outlets started reporting shortages. Investors demanded explanations. The stock price began falling. Millions disappeared within hours. Meanwhile, Frank sat quietly on the porch of his small farmhouse, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. For the first time in years, there was no phone ringing, no emergency dispatch, no late-night crisis, just silence, peaceful silence. Then his phone buzzed. He ignored it. A second call arrived, then a third, then 27 more. Everyone from company executives. Frank placed the phone face down. The people who laughed at him suddenly needed help, but they still hadn't learned anything. By Friday morning, the company entered full panic mode. Executives hired outside consultants, technology firms, supply chain specialists, transportation analysts. The bills climbed into the millions. Nobody could identify the cause, because nobody knew Frank had quietly connected hundreds of separate systems into one functioning network. His work wasn't documented, not because he was secretive, because nobody ever cared enough to ask. Years of experience existed only inside his head. Then came the twist. One young analyst discovered an old archived folder, buried deep within company records. Inside were thousands of files carrying the same initials. FD. Frank Dawson. The analyst opened them. What he found shocked everyone. Route designs, emergency contingency plans, seasonal traffic algorithms, fuel optimization models, disaster recovery systems, detailed maps, custom workflows, entire operating structures. The analyst stared at the screen. Then he whispered something that changed everything. Frank built this company. The room went silent. For the first time, executives realized the truth. The old truck driver wasn't a replaceable employee. He was the reason the business functioned. But there was still a problem. Nobody knew how to restart the system, and the losses were becoming catastrophic. That afternoon, the CEO personally drove to Frank's farmhouse. Black SUV, security team, corporate lawyers, the entire executive group. The same people who laughed, the same people who ignored him, the same people who celebrated his departure. Frank saw them pull into the driveway. He remained seated, calm. The CEO stepped forward. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, he said something nobody expected. "I'm sorry." Frank looked at him quietly. The executive swallowed hard. "We didn't understand what you built." Still silence. The CEO continued. "We need your help." For the first time, power had completely shifted. The man they viewed as obsolete now held the future of a billion-dollar operation in his hands. But then Frank revealed something unexpected. This had never been about revenge. Never. It was about respect. For years, he warned management about knowledge transfer, training programs, documentation, backup planning. Every proposal was rejected. Too expensive, too unnecessary, too old-fashioned. Now they were paying the price. The CEO lowered his head, because he knew Frank was right. The following Monday, an extraordinary meeting was held. Not behind closed doors, not in secret, but publicly, broadcast across the company. Thousands of employees watched. Drivers, dispatchers, warehouse workers, managers, everyone. The CEO walked onto the stage, then invited Frank beside him. The room erupted into applause. For nearly a minute, it continued. Many employees stood. Some even wiped away tears. Because unlike the executives, they knew exactly who Frank was. They knew who answered calls at 2 a.m., who helped stranded drivers, who solved impossible problems, who kept freight moving during storms. The CEO faced the audience, then delivered words nobody expected. The most important person in this company was sitting in the back of the room while we congratulated ourselves. Silence filled the auditorium. We confused titles with value. The cameras shifted toward Frank. We were wrong. Every executive stood, one by one, and applauded. The same people who once laughed now stood in front of the entire company acknowledging their mistake. Then came the final reversal. The board announced a new logistics division, not named after an executive, not named after a founder, named after Frank Dawson, the Dawson Operations Center. Employees erupted with applause. But the biggest surprise was still coming. Frank was offered a massive consulting contract worth millions. He accepted on one condition. Every experienced worker would be included in training and planning decisions moving forward. Drivers, mechanics, warehouse staff, the people who actually understood the work. The board agreed immediately. Over the next few months, the company recovered. Routes stabilized. Clients returned. Profits rebounded. But something more important changed. Respect. The culture transformed. Executives started listening. Veteran workers started teaching. Knowledge flowed instead of disappearing. And nobody laughed at experience anymore. One evening, months later, Frank stood outside the new operations center. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold. Truck engines rumbled in the distance. Young drivers entered the building carrying notebooks. Ready to learn. Ready to listen. The CEO walked beside him. "Funny," he said quietly. Frank glanced at him. The CEO smiled. "We spent millions on technology searching for answers." Frank nodded. "And?" The CEO looked toward the highway where hundreds of company trucks moved like a river across the horizon. The answer was sitting behind a steering wheel the whole time. Frank smiled softly, then looked toward the road he had traveled for most of his life. The road that taught him something no executive presentation ever could. People aren't valuable because of their title. They're valuable because of what they know. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is carrying the entire company on their shoulders. Nobody ignored Frank Dawson ever again.